The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight on a special Dan Rather Reports, fresh perspectives on America's nuclear future. The stakes are high. Advocates on both sides say it's a matter of life, death, and a global economic future. Environmentalists, statisticians, industry advocates. Rather's reporters fanned out from San Francisco to London to get the brightest minds and the most original perspectives.
Good evening. On April 26, 1986, 25 years ago, the nuclear reactor in the Ukrainian town of Chernobyl suffered a catastrophic accident. A plume of radiation spread over Europe, and fear over the safety of nuclear energy circled the globe. The world is now coming to grips with the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, and tonight we're going to consider the future of atomic energy from a variety of perspectives. The recent tragedy in Japan has fundamentally changed the politics, economics, and science of nuclear power. Almost everybody on all sides of the debate agrees on that, but there is no such harmony when it comes to a vision for the future. Chernobyl once held the distinction of being the worst nuclear disaster in history. Now the events in Fukushima, Japan, mirror those of the former Soviet Ukraine. The magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami have sparked a near meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And in Japan, like at Chernobyl, the fears of radiation exposure are all too real. Here in the United States, those realities have renewed the rhetoric and debate over nuclear energy.
It's a very expensive way to generate electricity. It's a very dangerous way to generate electricity.
Massachusetts Representative Edward Markey is at the center of the debate on the safety of nuclear energy. For more than 3 decades, he has been a watchdog on nuclear power safety. Fukushima, he says, is a stern reminder of what can go horribly wrong. In your judgment, what have we learned from Japan's response to their nuclear problems?
We learned that overconfidence breeds complacency, and that complacency breeds disaster. Japan is a technological equivalent nation to ours. They assumed that an accident of this nature could not occur, and when it did, because they assumed it could not occur, they were unprepared to deal with the consequences. I'm afraid that a certain amount of hubris runs through the American nuclear industry as well, and I think a little more humility in the wake of Fukushima would be appreciated from the nuclear industry here in the United States.
After Katrina, it was just about the consensus in the country that the government had let the people down. Now, in case of some natural disaster that complicates nuclear and results in a nuclear catastrophe, is our government right now prepared? Does it have a concrete and viable plan for that?
We do not. In fact, in the United States, we still haven't basically built in the protections that weren't there in Japan. We only require the batteries as a backup at a nuclear power plant to last 4 to 8 hours. We only require diesel fuel for 7 days in the event that there's a shutdown of a nuclear power plant. The federal government does not require the distribution of potassium iodide pills out to a 20-mile radius the way my 2002 law requires it to be distributed to protect against thyroid cancer. So there is not yet in place a plan that responds to a lot of the central issues that are being raised by Fukushima.
Well, a recent Gallup poll indicated that 56% of Americans believe nuclear power plants are safe. What does the American public not know, and you think they should know, about the safety of nuclear power plants?
Well, they should know that there is a limit to what man knows about any of these technologies. They should know that the nuclear industry is only willing to pay up to $12.6 billion for any accident, and then the taxpayer has to pick up the tab for any damage greater than that. They should also know that they're saying that their technology is so dangerous that they cannot build any nuclear power plants in our country without a taxpayer guaranteed loan.
Well, despite your efforts and those of some others to call attention to these problems, I quoted the poll earlier where 56% of the population said, well, we think nuclear power is safe. Does Japan change this equation?
I think Japan does change it for people because 56% of people might say nuclear power is safe, but a much smaller percentage say they would feel comfortable with a nuclear power plant built near their home. And that's the key statistic. This is one of those not in my backyard situations. I support nuclear power, but don't put it near me. I support nuclear power, but I don't want any nuclear waste near my home. I don't want any nuclear waste on the highway driving past my home. A mobile Chernobyl on the road heading towards wherever that nuclear waste is going to be stored. So it's a little bit like the old saying that everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. A lot of people might like nuclear power plants, but they don't want one in their neighborhood, and they certainly don't want that nuclear waste outside that nuclear power plant stored for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. And that, at the end of the day, is the Achilles heel of the nuclear industry.
If there was a nuclear power renaissance, is it now dead?
I think that if it's not dead, it is seriously wounded. And whatever number of new nuclear power plants they thought were going to be built over the next 20 to 25 years, you can cut that number by 50% or 75% because it is just going to scare the living daylights out of investors up in Wall Street to take a chance that something can go wrong with $8 billion it takes to build a new nuclear power plant in our country that they could have used to build a natural gas or a wind or a solar facility.
You represent a district in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. We went to MIT, and I get a different story from the scientists there. Mm-hmm. They're in favor of pushing for nuclear. They say we're not pushing hard enough. Do they tell that to you?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And what do you say?
What I say is that it may be a technology that in theory works very well in the laboratories, may work very well, but that it is not competitive in the marketplace with natural gas and wind and solar and energy efficiency technologies. So it may be a wonderful theory, but in practice, it just has not worked in the marketplace.
But one of the arguments frequently raised is, listen, Dan, they say, if the United States of America doesn't move to nuclear power in a big way in our lifetime and certainly our children's lifetime, that alone will virtually guarantee that we become a second-rate economic power. Do you believe that?
That would be looking at the United States in a technological rearview mirror. Natural gas has now taken the lead in new electrical generating capacity, closely followed by wind as the new contributors to electrical generating capacity, with solar and biomass and geothermal, and especially new energy efficiency technologies that are coming up fast on the outside. Left behind in the historical ash bin of history has been nuclear power for the last 36 years, and after Fukushima, I think that it will be very difficult for them to get in this race in a very serious way.
Now, you recently introduced what's officially called the Nuclear Power Plant Safety Act. Tell me about that. What does it propose?
It says that we should slow down on the licensing of any new nuclear power plants or the relicensing of old nuclear power plants until we incorporate the lessons of Fukushima. We should also look over at the issue of the battery length and how long they will last in the event that the electricity to a nuclear power plant is shut off the way it is in Fukushima. And the diesel fuel that we have there is a backup power source, which also ran out at Fukushima as well. These are the lessons I think that we have to draw from Fukushima, and my goal is to make sure that those questions are asked and answered before a new generation of nuclear power plants are constructed, or the old ones are relicensed for another 20 or 40 years.
Now, you've called, and correct me if I'm wrong, for a moratorium on approving any new nuclear plants. What about the argument that says that if it's a long moratorium, everybody agrees something short-term, pause, take a look. But anything approaching a medium or long-term moratorium is in effect killing nuclear power in this country. You agree with that?
We should have a moratorium that lasts as long as it takes to learn the lessons of Fukushima and to implement the lessons learned from Fukushima. That might be 3 months, it might be 6 months, it might be longer. That's up to the nuclear scientists to determine. That's up to safety experts to determine. But to not learn the lessons of Fukushima, in my opinion, would be reckless. It would be irresponsible because it would heighten the likelihood that we would see a repetition of what happened at Fukushima. So we need from the industry not a denial that problems have been identified, but rather a reconciliation with those problems that have been identified with solutions that are announced for the public that gives some confidence to them that they are not so arrogant that they ignore the catastrophic, historic accident that they're witnessing on their television sets every single night.
But you've said yourself several times here, it depends on investment. And the Wall Street, I think you said guys with the eye shades,
Yeah.
will take a look at it. But if you declare a moratorium and it lasts for 6 months, a year, or a year and a half, which one could well imagine it taking to absorb the lessons of Japan, back to the question, does or does not that really kill nuclear power for the future?
I don't think you have a choice any more than you had a choice after the Challenger accident. You have to go back and look at all of the safety questions. If you want to rebuild public confidence in the space program, you have to step back and say something went wrong if we are going to expect additional public investment. You don't want to end the program, but you can't ignore the safety implications.
Well, Congressman, you've long studied this problem. Are there any imminent threats, natural or man-made, that we should be talking about?
In the last 1 year, there has been an earthquake in Chile of historic proportion. There has been an earthquake in New Zealand of historic proportion, and one now in Japan. The fourth part of that quadrant across the Pacific is Northern California, Oregon, Washington State, up to Alaska. And we should just be humble in wondering what Mother Nature might have in store for us. And we should protect against that worst case scenario.
It may be a decade before we start to see what long-term health consequences the Fukushima meltdown has on the people of Japan. However, here in the United States, the most vocal nuclear opponents are saying the verdict is already in. Nuclear energy simply is not safe. When we come back, you will meet a scientist who says despite Fukushima, nuclear power still needs to be an important part of a clean energy future.
I sell $100 million nuclear power plants.
Earlier this year, we brought you a program on a new generation of nuclear reactors. Both scientists and investors had been bullish on these smaller, more affordable designs, some of which included what advocates said was a solution to the spent fuel.
So this runs.
We met Dr. Eric Lowen, a nuclear scientist who oversees advanced reactor designs for GE Hitachi, a joint venture building nuclear reactors.
If I'm right, Dan, then the United States would lead the world in a new clean energy source. If I'm right, we'll put this country on a path to get rid of nuclear waste.
We asked to speak to Dr. Lowen in the wake of the Japan disaster, but the Fukushima reactor was a GE design, and he declined to speak with us at this time.
So, welcome to our MIT reactor.
Dr. Ernest Moniz was also in our original report. He is a distinguished professor of physics at MIT and an advisor on President Obama's Council on Science and Technology. He agreed to sit down with us for this follow-up report. Well, Professor, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dan.
A lot has happened in the nuclear industry since we last met. I want to start by playing a piece from our previous interview, the half hour we did on looking ahead with nuclear power. Let's take a look and then we'll talk.
Great. I believe personally that we need to move towards establishing or reestablishing the nuclear option quickly. The only game in town, in my view, for some number of years is going to be evolutionary designs based upon what we've done in the past.
Well, Professor, looking back on what's happened with the disaster in Japan since we did that interview and had it on the air, do you still feel that reestablishing the nuclear option should be a priority for the country?
Yes, I do. And I keep the emphasis on the word option. Again, I'm thinking about it certainly in terms of what the government can do, and I believe that the nuclear option remains a very important one. Clearly, the conditions will be changed post Fukushima.
Well, realistically, is it possible, is it probable that nuclear power and other alternative systems will be viewed in the same way going forward as they were pre-Japan?
I certainly think that nuclear power will be viewed differently and will be regulated differently. We still don't know what the final outcome in Japan will be, and we certainly don't know exactly the causes. However, I believe there are a number of things that I would put a bet on. Nuclear power will get more costly in the United States through some additional requirements. License extension, extending from 40 years to 60 years the lives of our current reactors, will be looked at with much more scrutiny. Third, I think how we manage spent fuel will change. And fourth, perhaps of less cosmic consequence, but I think very important, is the way we think about the research and development for future systems will change.
Well, let's talk about research and development for future systems. In the program we had on the air prior to Japan, when you and I talked, we spent time talking about a decision. Should we stick with the traditional large nuclear power plants of the sort that have been built, or should we leap ahead to the newer technologies, including modular, smaller units, even the so-called bathtub nuclear plants? Has that changed given Japan?
I think there will be a shift, which we have advocated long before the Japanese event, towards optimizing our current systems, making them more efficient, improved passive safety systems, and that will apply to both the large reactors and to the small reactors.
Right. I talked to a congressman from your state, from this state, from Massachusetts. So he says nuclear power ought to be in our rearview mirror, not among the things we consider actively as part of our energy problem-solving future. To that, you would say what?
Well, again, I think that we need to have as many options as we can for zero carbon-emitting technologies, and I just don't see how we get from here to there without every option that we can draw upon, and that includes nuclear power.
Well, outline for me your concern and the concern of others who are in the field about a hiatus. There are voices saying, look, we just need to stop everything. We need a moratorium on everything, small, modular, and the big ones. What's your concern about such a hiatus?
A hiatus, I think, would be a very bad idea. Operationally, as I say, in the nuclear business in the United States, it's not like we are out there building 25 nuclear power plants. I think we should stay on the track that we're on while we are calmly absorbing the lessons of Fukushima, deciding what we want to do in terms of changing how spent fuel is managed.
Well, let's talk about that, the spent fuel problem, if you will, that you testified before Congress, read your testimony, and you said that the Japanese disaster should make us look hard at how we currently handle our spent nuclear fuel.
Our storage of spent fuel, in my view, from a policy perspective, has been simply an afterthought. And frankly, we had no serious policy construct at all with regard to the spent fuel. So now what's happened is that it's been piling up at sites. So we have about 57, I believe, different spent fuel storage sites, much of it in pools, as we have read a lot about in Japan, some of it moving into what's called dry cask storage, which does not require active water cooling. And in my view, we should have a policy established that will determine what we do with our various forms of nuclear waste. We believe that the question has not yet been answered whether the fuel that comes out of reactors is waste or possibly an energy resource for the future.
There are a lot of unanswered questions about how to efficiently and safely provide electricity for our ever-growing needs. Dr. Moniz says we need to conserve more and invest in other forms of alternative energy. But he says now is not the time to turn our back on nuclear power.
I have a sense of urgency, again, driven by my concern about climate change. The fundamental issue is that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere and stays for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. So it is a cumulative effect. And every day, every hour, every second that goes by, we globally are emitting lots and lots of CO2. We are emitting in the United States about 6 billion tons per year, and about 30 billion tons in the world. So the clock is ticking, and I don't believe we have time to waste, which is why I believe there are 3 actions that we need to take right now. One is we should get serious about efficiency, reducing demand to accomplish what we want to do. Secondly, we really have to get on with the displacement of our oldest, most inefficient coal plants with natural gas, which is much, much less carbon intense. And third, we have to innovate as hard as we can so that, roughly speaking, 10 years from now, we have the technologies that really move us to no greenhouse gas emissions. We don't have 5 years. I mean, frankly, we've in my view, we've lost a decade already.
Squandered a decade.
We squandered a decade, and the more time we squander, the harder it's going to be to reach the kinds of goals that we want. We should resist kind of saying, there's one silver bullet solution to all of this. We're going to need a bunch of arrows in the quiver, and that goes back again. My view is efficiency, gas, and innovate and get those options ready, because we're going to need them in about 10 years.
While Dr. Moniz says one of those arrows in the quiver for clean energy must be nuclear power, that's an idea that has split the environmental community. Long before the events in Japan, critics had complained about the safety of nuclear energy. Many of those criticisms grew from the nuclear weapons disarmament protests, but in recent years, some of those critics have changed their tune, embracing nuclear power as a clean energy alternative to combat global warming. But Michael Brune isn't one of them. And as a prominent environmentalist and executive director of the Sierra Club, Brune says the disaster in Japan has reinvigorated the debate about nuclear power.
Well, I think it'd be a curious time right now to be saying that nuclear power is safe. We just had one of the biggest disasters the world has ever seen related to any form of energy production.
But environmentalists like Brune say they are worried about more than safety. They argue that from an economic standpoint as well, nuclear power just doesn't make sense.
When you hear someone who says that nuclear power is safe, what you have to remember is that there's not a single bank on Wall Street that would finance a nuclear power plant unless taxpayers covered the costs of a catastrophic event, so there was a liability cap, and unless taxpayers would foot the costs in the form of loan guarantees. You won't find a single bank that will finance nuclear power because they believe that these plants are too risky. The Sierra Club believes that every $1 billion that would be invested in a nuclear power plant is $1 billion that is much better invested in clean energy technologies. And if we're throwing more money at nuclear power, that's less public dollars that could be invested in clean energy that would cut pollution and put more people to work.
And the disaster in Japan, he says, may just be the tipping point for moving aggressively towards other options in energy.
As we look out over the next 10 years, I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, both because the price of solar and wind are dropping significantly, and the installation, the amount of solar and wind that we're installing is accelerating at a dramatic rate, experiencing record growth rates in both industries. We'll see more panels up on rooftops and less big solar farms out in the desert. We'll see more wind farms offshore where they can't be seen, producing up to 20–25% of the total energy consumption in the United States. And so gradually, over the next 5 years, certainly over the next 10 years, we'll be able to, not only will we not have to build new plants, but we'll be able to shut down the oldest, the dirtiest, the least safe facilities and rapidly transition towards clean energy.
The United States government has asked Americans living within 50 miles of Fukushima to evacuate. Brune says here at home we should also pay attention to what's in our own backyard.
1/3 of Americans live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. So the 20 million Americans who live outside of Indian Point, my parents who live near Oyster Creek, which is on Barnegat Bay in New Jersey, the people in California who are living near the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. Those would be 3 plants that I would cite as being at the top of the list for safety concerns, if not for environmental reasons. We don't leave till tomorrow night.
For Brune, heeding mistakes already made is the most valuable lesson learned in moving forward.
I would advise folks to understand that there have been thousands of people living within the 20-mile radius outside of Fukushima who have been exposed to significant levels of radiation exposure. And what we know is that many of those people will be suffering for a long time after the cameras have gone away and the news reports are no longer focusing on the reactor. The impact on human health of this disaster will be felt for years and years and years into the future. And so the comparison from nuclear power to other forms of energy really is one that has to factor in both cost and human health, and nuclear power suffers in that comparison every time.
When we come back, we'll give you a look at how the nuclear industry is reacting to a shift in public opinion. That's straight ahead. Here in the United States, we're about as far away from weaning ourselves off of nuclear energy as we are from doing the same with foreign oil. But while experts and pundits around the globe debate the importance of environmental, safety, and security issues, a few have a different take entirely on nuclear energy. We talked with one man who looks beyond the rhetoric to the statistics.
I think among the sort of more traditional, if I can put it that way, forms of electricity generation, that nuclear is relatively safe.
Paul Wilkinson is a leading expert on public health and environment at the University of London. He co-authored an article in the medical journal Lancet, which examined data from myriad sources to study the relationships between environmental exposures and health effects.
We were interested to try to understand what health effects are associated with different forms of electricity generation. So specifically, what effects arising mainly from air pollution exposure and from occupational injuries there were in relation to the use of coal for electricity generation, gas, nuclear energy, and so on.
Wilkinson says these statistics paint a picture that is unmistakable.
Well, overall, nuclear energy as a source of electricity production has comparatively low impacts on health compared to things such as burning coal and oil and so on. And the main reason for that difference is because it has very low emissions to the environment of the type that are well established from particle pollution, for example, that cause the health effects associated with burning of fossil fuels. Clearly, the emissions that it does give off to the environment are of a different kind, radioactive materials. Generally, though, they are fairly low levels, and the sorts of impacts that are associated with them are overall much smaller than those associated with oil, coal, and gas burning. And the reason for that is because production methods that burn fossil fuels give rise to measurable changes in the air pollution around us all. A lot of people breathe it in, and though the effects are small to any individual, you can add up the total impact on health, and it amounts to hundreds, thousands of deaths on a fairly regular basis.
Those deaths occur from everyday exposure to carbon emissions that most people don't even think about. However, when a big nuclear accident occurs, though rare, Wilkinson says public perception is that the risk is much higher than it actually is.
It remains to be seen what the impacts of the Fukushima accident will be. I think probably, even though it was very unpalatable, the overall impact on health will still be relatively modest, but clearly was much more visible. It's the sort of thing that's reached headlines all around the world and is the thing which instills a lot of concern among individuals.
Wilkinson acknowledges that it's hard to balance the comfort level of technology with that of safety. Still, in the end, the data Dr. Wilkinson analyzed lead to one conclusion.
I'm not comfortable myself with the risks associated with nuclear energy production, but it is a technology which exists. It is relatively well understood. It has comparatively low health impacts. Despite the accidents, the overall balance is still more in favor of nuclear than it is in terms of burning fossil fuels. And if it was the choice of the two, personally, I think the nuclear industry is favorable to fossil fuel burning.
While the stats might be in favor of nuclear, the odds clearly are not. Perhaps no one is feeling that more than those in the business of building nuclear facilities.
What's the plan? Where will we be doing it? How will we be working with the utilities?
David Crane is CEO of Princeton-based NRG Energy, which develops and invests in energy products from wind and solar to natural gas and nuclear. One of his biggest investments is adding 2 new nuclear reactors to an existing nuclear power site in South Texas. It's a slow, decade-long process, but it was moving ahead until the earthquake hit Japan. Well, you've been in the business for what, 25 years?
Yes.
Well, how are you feeling about it at this moment?
Well, I'm not feeling so good. I mean, clearly, first of all, this tragedy in Japan, we're partners with Tokyo Electric on our nuclear project in Texas. They're very good people, and it's hard not to feel empathy for everyone over in Japan. But when you think of those heroic workers at the site, which are doing their utmost under the most difficult conditions imaginable, as a member of that industry, I feel immense empathy for what's going on. But overall, it's a very unsettling time as well, because our traditional mission was safety, reliability, and affordability. And about 10 years ago, the idea that we also had to deal with climate change. And at least from my point of view, I thought that nuclear power was the solution to all 4 of those. And now, with the situation being so difficult to build nuclear, to me, what was going to underpin the power industry in the United States for the next 50 years now gravely in doubt. So succinctly, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a firm believer in the U.S. nuclear renaissance, and I think it's in grave danger right now.
Also in grave danger, Crane's multi-million-dollar nuclear plant in Texas. One of the biggest backers was Japan's Tokyo Electric, the beleaguered owners of the Fukushima plant. They're now unable to fund their share of NRG's project, making Crane's long, tedious process even longer, if indeed it survives at all. If I'm a nuclear power plant executive and I hear that your company is slowing down, possibly not going to do the Texas project, possibly, this might give me pause to invest in any new nuclear plant.
Well, and I think, Dan, this is a huge setback, and I don't think too many business executives will follow the path that we follow, that just one of the issues with business building nuclear power, and keep in mind we're virtually the only country that builds nuclear power plants through almost completely private enterprise. If you look at where a lot of nuclear plants are built, France, well, Japan, now the biggest nuclear construction programs of the world are in China, India, and Abu Dhabi. They're basically being done by the government, because the issue for a business person is that it just takes so darn long to build a nuclear plant. We've been in development of this project for 5 years. We had been planning on starting construction next year, and there'd be 5 more years of construction. So you basically have a decade of investment before a nuclear plant produces revenue. And that's a cycle, a time cycle that's very long for the average business. So I think there's no doubt that this has been a huge setback for the nuclear renaissance in the United States, and really outside of a couple nuclear plants that will be built in the Deep South. At this point, without some really strong leadership on this issue in Washington, I think it's very unlikely that more nuclear plants get built in this decade in this country.
What needs to happen for NRG not to pull the plug on this new, latest technology nuclear plant in South Texas?
About 7 things need to happen.
All right, let's take them all.
Okay. First of all, the NRC review needs to be done in a very timely fashion.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Yes, and their safety review. If they take as long as they did after 3 Mile Island, which was years, then we are, as they say, dead on arrival. But if at the end of 90 days they say, you know, from here on in, we're going to concentrate on plants in seismic areas that are subject to tsunami risks, that are very close to major urban areas. None of those things apply to our plant. And so if we could get a clear bill of health after 90 days, that would be number one. Number two, we need to get the DOE loan guarantee, because nuclear plants are just too big to build in this country with the Wall Street's health still being on the mend. So
these are government loans, with the emphasis on loans.
Yes, yes, which we pay for.
Right.
In fact, we pay a several $100 million fee to get that loan.
All right, number 3?
Number 3 actually is, our project was always based on also getting Japanese government financing, because since it's been 30 years since we built a nuclear plant in the United States, right now the technology is manufactured essentially either in Japan or France. And our project depends on over $2 billion of Japanese export financing. Number 4, we need a municipality in Texas to agree to buy a certain amount of the power from the plant.
I thought San Antonio had agreed to do that.
There were discussions with San Antonio about doing that, and one of the announcements that came out after Fukushima was that they were putting those discussions on hold.
I see.
The 5th thing is that the plant was going to be built by a combination of Toshiba of Japan plus the Shaw Group of the United States. They need to continue to reaffirm that they will do that for a fixed price. But the 6th one is that one of the big owners in the project was going to be Tokyo Electric. And so they either need to continue to agree to do that, or we need to find a substitute major owner in the project to invest alongside us.
And number 7?
And Dan, there's a timing question in all that, because I don't have any doubt that we could pull those 6 things together, but you know, we have a certain team mobilized to do this, and once you sort of demobilize that team, it's hard to put the pieces back together. So all those things need to come together in a timely fashion and in a coordinated fashion. And that, in this environment where if any one of those 6 things fails, that's a Herculean task. And so that's why I'm not sitting here being optimistic about it, even though probably I should be.
Your opinion, can the United States remain a world economic power of the first rank and turn its back on nuclear power?
I think that to stay as an economic power in the first rank, the United States needs to embrace the clean energy economy that places like China and Europe have embraced ahead of us. And the clean energy economy, I think, has gotten stuck, like so many things, in the partisan divide in Washington. And I think that that's extremely unfortunate, because any field that offers the promise of a lot of jobs and a lot of technological innovation the United States should be inherently the leader, and there has been immense innovation in the United States in the last few years. But if that innovation gets deployed in China rather than in the United States, then China will build up the manufacturing and the jobs, and then they will be exporting to us. Even if the United States, as a result of Fukushima, turns its back on nuclear power and goes in the direction that the Sierra Club would have us go in, China and India will build new nuclear power plants.
Whatever we do, they're
whatever
gonna
we
build it.
do. And I maintain, and I maintain this passionately with every chromosome in my body, that the world is a safer place with the United States and the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission as the world's leader in safety, nuclear safety. And if we are not building advanced nuclear plants, we forfeit that position, and it will automatically be assumed by China, India, and the other overwhelmingly developing countries, many of whom have never built a nuclear power plant before. They will take the lead on nuclear safety, and I don't really think that's in anyone's interest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
NRG just announced that plans for their Texas nuclear plant have stalled. They still stand behind the project, but say at this time they will not continue to invest additional capital. Straight ahead on the program, a look back at Chernobyl from a unique point of view. At the Ukrainian Museum in downtown New York, there's an exhibit marking the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. It was planned long before the events in Japan, but it suddenly has taken on an eerie relevance. The centerpiece of the exhibit is a collection of photographs of Chernobyl today, including the people still living and working around the contaminated site. The pictures are the work of a photojournalist who spent the better part of 2 years living and experiencing Chernobyl.
My name is Michael Forster Rothbard. I'm a photojournalist. In my work, I'm really interested in understanding the human consequences of environmental issues. I spent 2 years in Chernobyl trying to understand the daily lives of the people who are still living there a generation after the accident. I went with the question in my mind of, if I lived near Chernobyl, would I stay? And that's what I asked the people who lived there. I asked, why did you stay? People had all kinds of answers. They stayed because this is home. They stayed because they felt a sense of duty to stay. Some stayed because they had employment. For the people working in the Chernobyl zone, they get paid pretty well, the equivalent of about $500 a month, which for Ukraine is a very high salary. Other people stay because they feel stuck. They have nowhere else to go. Inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, there are about 400 people who are illegal resettlers, who basically refuse to leave. They were evacuated and they came back as soon as they could. And when you go visit them, it feels like stepping into another century because, they're living off the land. As one woman, Maria Yorupa, said to me, I would rather die here than live anywhere else. Viktor Gaidak the Gaidak family is one of the families I photographed. And the very first time I met Viktor Gaidak, he yanked up his shirt to show me the scar on his chest. He had colon cancer. He worked at the Chernobyl plant for 24 years, including 9 years after the accident. And he told me when I had colon cancer, he said, we sold our car, we sold our refrigerator, we sold everything we could to pay for the surgery. And now my wife Lydia has cancer and there's nothing left to sell. And so that moment of him pulling up his shirt stuck with me, because in that picture he has this sort of defiant expression on his face, like, this is who I am and this is what I've been through. And I want the world to see it. It's important for people to realize that what's happening now is that the secondary effects from the accident are as important as the primary effects of health problems and radiation. And if you think about the population that's affected, it's true. 350,000 people were evacuated from the Chernobyl-affected areas, and today, between 5.5 million and 6 million people are still living in the contaminated areas. And so, of course, there's all sorts of problems. You know, I saw people with, you know, alcoholism and depression and other substance abuse and problems with corruption and worrying about their children and worrying about their jobs. And so all of those are results of the Chernobyl accident. They're not the primary result, but they're important for us to consider. And if we think about nuclear issues here, somehow that's never part of the conversation. It's kind of bizarre to know that you're in the spot where an important historical event happened. I knew I was only going to have about 25 minutes inside the control room 4. And it's dark in there. Once I was in there in this dark cave of a room, a burned out control room, I wished I had, you know, several flashes to light it up. I just had one assistant with a flash. To be there and imagine what was going through their minds. The reactor was heating up, and they were trying to find a way to cool it down. They had stopped the emergency backup system because the Chernobyl accident happened during a test. So they had turned off the emergency system. So to know that there was nothing they could do, and it was about maybe a minute and a half as it was heating up before it blew up. I mean, what a terrifying experience that must have been. To actually be in that room and think, okay, well, this is, you know, this changed, not only was an environmental catastrophe, but it changed world history. I think people find in Chernobyl whatever they're looking for. So if they're looking for tragedy, that's what they find. If they're looking for hope, that's what they find. I think the one thing that I hope people take away from seeing my exhibit is an understanding that, you know, life just goes on in Chernobyl. And despite the radiation, you know, people aren't so different from you and I. They're just living their lives and doing the best they can. And yes, the radiation is always in the background, but they don't necessarily think about it every day.
Chernobyl in recent years has actually become a popular tourist attraction, drawing busloads of visitors from around the world. They are given radiation meters and some wear gas masks, but they don't linger for long, just enough for a short glimpse and a photograph of one of history's catastrophes. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.